For a brief, dust-choked 5 years in mid-20th century Mexico, the newly completed segments of the Pan American Highway played host to what might conservatively be described as the most brutal test of automotive engineering and human endurance ever sanctioned by a national government, the Carrera Panamericana. The race emerged from Mexico's completion of their section of the Pan American Highway, a project with roots stretching back to an 1889 proposal for a railroad connecting the Americas, later transformed into a highway plan by 1923, as automobiles began rendering rail travel obsolete. 14 American nations formalized this ambitious project by signing the Convention on the Pan American Highway in 1937, though their coordination was promptly interrupted when some idiot on the other side of the Atlantic decided to invade Poland, redirecting attention and resources elsewhere. Mexico's portion represented a particular engineering challenge, with elevations exceeding 10,000 feet through terrain that, while very scenically compelling, presented nightmarish problems for highway engineers. The final achievement of this megaproject was made all the more notable by the fact that Mexico completed it without foreign aid, an impressive economic feat for any nation, but all the more so from one that had just emerged from decades of civil wars, political instability, and a global depression. To celebrate this triumph of asphalt and engineering over geography and topography, Mexican officials conceived a race traversing the longest continuous section of the new highway system. The course would run north to south from Ciudad Juarez at the U.S. border to El Ocotal, recently renamed as Ciudad Cuauhtémoc, at the Guatemalan border, covering approximately 2,178 miles, or 3,505 kilometers, over 8 stages and 5 days, though this was eventually expanded to 9 stages across 6 days. The inaugural 1950 race accepted any 5-passenger closed-body standard passenger car, explicitly excluding sports cars, convertibles, and coupes. Entrants could only use regular factory equipment with limited allowances for expanded fuel tanks, improved shock absorbers, and minimal lightening of non-essential bodywork. Though still fairly liberal entry standards, they were significantly more restrictive than the essential free-for-all of the Mille Miglia, for instance, and thus it was a lot less likely to have the Mexican equivalent of Giuseppe from the next village over showing up in his little Cinquecento for a day or two's entertainment. The entry fee of 2,500 pesos, equivalent to roughly $3,800 in 2025, covered insurance for vehicle damage and standardized 80-octane Pemex fuel. Contestants were required to maintain minimum average speeds of 50 miles an hour, or 80 kph, over each leg to remain eligible for the grand prizes that totaled 330,500 pesos, equivalent to $38,200 at the time, or approximately $500,000 US in today's currency. American skepticism about Mexico's ability to organize such an ambitious event was addressed in an appropriately direct manner. Bob Estes, owner of a California Lincoln Mercury dealership, personally led a small fact-finding mission to Mexico City, driving a used 49 Lincoln to test both the roads and the Mexican gas. After confirming the organizers had secured the prize money and established adequate logistics to support the race, and satisfied as to the quality of the roads and fuel, Estes placed an advertisement at his own expense in the LA Times encouraging participation in the race, a ringing endorsement that reportedly generated 20 additional entries before the April 25th deadline. The entry list ultimately comprised of between 126 and 131 cars, predominantly American machinery piloted by a mix of American and Mexican drivers. Large American sedans dominated, Cadillacs, Lincolns, Buicks, and Mercurys, though the field included several Nashes, led by NASCAR founder Bill France Sr., a solitary Jaguar Mark V, representing the British side of things, and a few last-minute entries from across the pond, including a Delahaye 175 from France, and 2 semi-custom-built Alfa Romeo 6Cs, accompanied by Italian drivers Piero Taruffi and Felice Bonetto. There were also 10 women on the entry list, most paired with male counterparts, though one all-female team did compete, a rarity for the era. The international flavor extended to teams from Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Guatemala, and one Mexican who, for reasons left unexplained, registered himself as representing the Republic of China, what we today more commonly refer to as Taiwan. One would, in retrospect, reasonably question how organizers justified staging a high-speed road race across such vast distances when similar events had been largely abandoned elsewhere in the world, mainly due to safety concerns. Several factors enabled this arguably reckless undertaking. First, Mexico had a relatively low population density in many of the regions along the route when compared to pre-war Europe, and there were several decades of circumspection in road safety and design between the 1900s and the 1950s. Second, race organizer Senor Antonio Cornejo, a Mexico City Pontiac dealer and radio station owner, managed to secure cooperation from all levels of the Mexican government, enlisting not just local police, but the entire Mexican military, the federal law enforcement, and an army of volunteers. The day before the race was to pass through their territories, the Mexican states deployed mounted cavalry with orders to ensure no livestock strayed within 1.5 miles of the roadway and with permission to shoot any loose animals. Roads were closed an hour before each day's start, with spectators encouraged to watch from rooftops in urban areas or maintain at least a 50-yard distance from the road in rural sections, though compliance was obviously difficult to enforce. Military personnel, tow trucks, and ambulances were stationed at regular intervals, while motorcycle police and aircraft patrolled to ensure that no wreck went unattended for too long. Third, and perhaps most cynically, the world was still recovering from the combined traumas of the Great Depression and World War II. The deaths that had previously led to road racing bans simply didn't register with the same urgency after millions had perished in combat in a world war and millions more in humanitarian disasters, and deaths that occurred hundreds or thousands of miles away in a sporting event held even less underlying significance. I do want to note that that's not to minimize the deaths in any way, and we will pay our respects to those who were killed throughout the event in the video, but it is what it is. The race was scheduled to begin on May 5th, 1950, Cinco de Mayo, commemorating Mexico's victory over French forces at the Battle of Puebla. Participants traveled from across Mexico, the United States, and beyond to reach Ciudad Juarez for the start. Starting positions for the first leg were determined by drawing lots in Mexico City a couple of days before the event, with most drivers represented by proxy due to last-minute logistical changes that moved the drawing from the start point to the capital for better publicity. The stage was thus set for what would rapidly evolve from a regional contest primarily featuring modified American sedans into one of the world's premier international racing events, only to collapse just as quickly under the weight of its well-earned reputation for danger following the 1955 Le Mans disaster that forced racing organizers worldwide to confront the need for improved safety measures. What began as a celebration of new infrastructure would leave a legacy of dust, innovation, and death etched across the Mexican countryside and the racing world at large. The inaugural Carrera Panamericana of 1950 was less a carefully planned motorsport event and more an exercise in trial, error, and mechanical attrition that masqueraded as a celebration of Mexico's newly completed section of the Pan American Highway. It was a 2,178-mile odyssey that would claim one driver, one spectator, and 79 vehicles before reaching its conclusion. Some 126 stock cars, a term interpreted with not inconsiderable elasticity, arrived at Ciudad Juarez by May 5, 1950, to begin the 9-stage journey southward. The organizers established a staggered start with 1-minute intervals between competitors and an additional 4 minutes after each 20th starter, an arrangement suggesting they had at least considered the possibility of traffic catastrophe. Luis Iglesias Avalos of Mexico City won the lottery for proverbial pole position, though this distinction was largely meaningless for a 5-day, multi-stage, 2,000-odd-mile race. Nevertheless, he set off first from Ciudad Juarez, with 233 miles separating him and Chihuahua, passing over relatively flat terrain, but this first stage immediately established the race's character. Tires began disintegrating almost immediately, with the semi-official Mexican presidential office entry managing to crash twice in one day, yet still continuing on. Roof crushed, windshield absent, driver nursing a broken arm, but apparently national pride trumps structural integrity and, in their case, the written rulebook, as they did arrive well beyond schedule. Bill Sterling, a retired Navy mechanic with minimal racing experience, took the stage in his 1950 Cadillac at an average speed of 100.425 miles an hour. The top 16 finishers were all Americans in American cars, demonstrating both the clear advantage of raw horsepower on the straightaways and the creative tuning of those more interested in victory than a strict reading of the rulebook. 13 competitors failed to finish, including Enrique Hachmeister of Guatemala. He was the first victim of the Pan Am who died of a fractured skull after his Lincoln left the road at a little bit over 105 miles an hour, shortly after leaving Ciudad Juarez. As the race progressed through Chihuahua, Durango, and into the mountains, the terrain became mountainous and began favoring smaller, more nimble vehicles. Stage 2 brought fewer casualties, but established the pattern of extensive paperwork requirements, with the Moran brothers disqualified for bypassing a checkpoint. That was shortly before they crashed their Cadillac and would have been forced to withdraw anyway. By Stage 4, from Durango to León, the highest altitude sections reached well over 8,000 feet, requiring carburetor adjustments and other engine tuning. The attrition rate remained steady, with Johnny Mance gradually moving into the overall lead from Bill Sterling. Meanwhile, the European contingent, namely the Alphas, began their slow climb up the standings, with Piero Taruffi's Alpha making its first appearance in the top 20. The Durango to León leg was unfortunately also the stage which cost the life of a spectator, the only instance during this race, when Edwin Solohub lost control of his car heading into a river ford in Lagos de Moreno, driving into a crowd of onlookers and killing a Mrs. Tomasa Lopez, as well as injuring 2 others. Media coverage, though frequently sensationalized and often inaccurate, with some radio stations claiming nearly 10 deaths by the race's midpoint, was also attracting increasing crowds, and by the time the race reached Mexico City, on Stage 5 at the end of Day 3, estimates suggested between 500,000 and 1 million spectators lining the route, approximately 1/3 of the capital's population. The mountains between Mexico City and Puebla on Stage 6 presented the first truly technical driving challenges. 2 local heroes, Fernando Raso Maciel and Jose Estrada Menocal, secured Mexico's only stage victory, indeed a 1-2, in their Packards, crediting victory to their nimbler machines and intimate knowledge of the mountain passes. The Italians, in the sprightly Alphas, began showing competitive form as well, finishing 9th and 10th. Stage 7 from Puebla to Oaxaca proved pivotal as torrential rain and hail swept across the route. The combination of weather and winding mountain roads reduced average speeds below 70 miles an hour, but allowed the Italians their best showing, with Felice Bonetto and co-driver Bruno Bonini winning handily in their Alpha. Johnny Mance's day, on the other hand, deteriorated from gastrointestinal distress, what we would call colloquially Montezuma's revenge, to mechanical calamity when his brakes failed about 65 miles out of Oaxaca. After limping across the finish line in 66th position for the leg, he dropped from 1st to 9th overall. The penultimate stage of the first race finished in Tuxtla Gutierrez and saw Bill Sterling's Cadillac suffer its own brake failure, dropping him from 1st, that he had inherited from Mance, to 29th and effectively ending his challenge for the race. Tom Deal then took the overall lead, with Herschel McGriff's Oldsmobile just 8.5 minutes behind. For the final 171-mile stage to El Ocotal, the last 107 miles consisted of unpaved roads. Thus, the Great Mexican Road Race would conclude not on the highway, but as a rally. This section became more a war of preparation strategy. Johnny Mance started confident. He had a good supply of racing tires still to use, but he found he faced a road surface composed of fist-sized rocks rather than the fine gravel that he had been promised. McGriff, meanwhile, had acquired substantially stouter General Popo tires on the promise that he wouldn't have to pay for them if he won. So he felt it gentlemanly to do so. Curtis Turner initially actually won the stage, but was later disqualified as he had been illegally substituted as driver for Roy Pat Connors Nash, as that was the marque's best-placed car. Mance lost all 4 tiles within minutes of reaching the gravel section and limped into El Ocotal, well behind the pace, while McGriff and co-driver Ray Elliott nearly lost everything when they bottomed out, traveling at approximately 100 miles an hour with just 20 miles remaining, gouging both their fuel tank and oil pan. Herschel McGriff and Ray Elliott nevertheless claimed overall victory in their Oldsmobile 88, purchased for $1,900 and earning them more than $17,500 in prize money. Though they had never won a stage, nor earned a single leg prize until the last one, they had run a clean, consistent race, and this told in the end. Tom Deal and Sam Cresap finished second in a Cadillac 62, a mere 76 seconds behind after nearly 28 hours of racing. Americans dominated the podium, with Taruffi and Isidoro Ceroli's Alfa the highest-placed non-American entry in fourth, while Luis Leal Solares achieved the best result for a Mexican driver in seventh in another Oldsmobile. The statistics told their own story. Of the 13 Oldsmobiles that started, 9 finished, with 6 in the top 20. Every DeSoto, Chrysler, Chevrolet, and Studebaker that began completed the course, while no Packards finished and only one of the 9 Hudsons survived. Hardly compelling advertising for those latter manufacturers. Ultimately, the first race revealed 2 critical mechanical vulnerabilities: brakes and tires. While few cars were directly disqualified due to tire issues, the required repairs significantly affected their driving times, and those who didn't have the outright speed or the talent to make up the delays were frequently out of the running as a result. Brake failures more frequently ended races altogether, or dropped contenders from the overall lead, as demonstrated by both Mance and Sterling's misfortunes. Similarly, the mountain roads, though well constructed for ordinary conditions, simply weren't designed for vehicles traveling in excess of 70 or 80 miles an hour through tight bends. Most drivers reportedly executed controlled power slides to try to maintain their speed, which was a technique that fundamentally favored the lighter vehicles, not just for reduced stress on their brakes and tires, but for their superior acceleration capacity out of the corners. The prize-giving ceremony featured more than 80 trophies distributed with questionable results. Most notably, the presidential entry that should have been disqualified on day 1 received quite a substantial trophy, and McGriff received the smaller second-place trophy, despite coming in first, but he did collect the 150,000 peso check that he had been promised. Initially conceived as a one-time celebration, the race generated such excitement and economic benefit that discussions for the second Carrera began almost immediately. It was decided the next edition would run in November to attract higher-caliber competitors, with revised rules allowing greater mechanical modifications, as long as a car could nominally carry 4 passengers, had a closed cockpit, and retained its original engine block and stock camshaft. The subsequent race would attract the attention of European manufacturers in earnest, with Ferrari and Lancia joining the fray in 1951. The second running of Mexico's border-to-border race saw Italian engineering triumph over American power in a contest that was eminently more professional, more competitive, and considerably deadlier than its inaugural edition. With the course now reversed, and the timing shifted to November to avoid Mexico's rainy season, the 1951 event presented a new slate of challenges for the 104 accepted entries, of which between 91 and 99 actually took the start in Tuxtla Gutierrez. The battle lines were clearly drawn. Ferrari and Lancia on the Italian side, with their nimble, lightweight chassis and sophisticated engines, against a formidable American contingent headlined by 15 Chryslers equipped with the new Firepower Hemi V8. Bill Sterling led the Chrysler troops, while Phil Walters benefited from Briggs Cunningham's preparation expertise on his car. Carl Kiekhaefer, who had modified several entries, reportedly had the Hemi producing 230 horsepower, a substantial increase over the stock 180 horsepower output. The American representation extended beyond Chrysler, however, with 24 Oldsmobiles entered, 15 by Mexican drivers, several Hudson Hornets with their superior handling characteristics, and a hastily prepared 48 Mercury sent by Ford after their Lincoln entry program ran out of time. This last-minute effort, piloted by Troy Ruttman with engine man Clay Smith as co-driver, would prove surprisingly competitive. The route covered 3,113 kilometers, or 1,933 miles, in 8 stages over 5 days of racing, with 1 rest day inserted between the 3rd and 4th days. Starting from Tuxtla Gutierrez on November 20th, the course traversed through Oaxaca, Puebla, Mexico City, León, Durango, Parral, Chihuahua, and finished in Ciudad Juarez on the border with the United States on November 25th. This mirrored the previous year's route in reverse, excepting the final leg from Tuxtla to El Ocotal, but the November timing meant significantly different conditions. There were cooler temperatures, but equally treacherous roads characterized by dramatic elevation changes, from as low as 328 feet at Tehuantepec to almost 10,500 feet at Iztaccíhuatl. Ferrari's strategy for the race reflected a typical Italian elegance. win in the mountains where their handling advantage would be greatest, then defend on the later flat, straight sections where American horsepower would level the playing field. To minimize weight and maximize maneuverability, the Ferraris carried only 2 spare tires each. However, this calculated plan disintegrated, as so many do, upon first contact with reality. The volcanic rock-based asphalt between Tuxtla and Oaxaca proved brutally abrasive to the Ferrari's speed-optimized Pirellis. Both cars suffered flats within minutes of the start, and having quickly exhausted their limited spares, they limped to Oaxaca in embarrassingly poor positions. Taruffi and co-driver Luigi Cinetti finished in 15th, and the Ascari Villoresi car was all the way down in 45th. The first day's casualties also included defending champion Herschel McGriff, whose Oldsmobile suffered an ignited fuel line mere miles from the start. Co-driver Jim Thompson's contribution to this emergency, as McGriff dryly noted, consisted primarily of taking photographs. Thank you, Jim. Both Lancias encountered troubles as well. Giovanni Bracco managed to reach Oaxaca in 54th place despite a failed fuel line and tire problems, while Bonetto's Road and Track-sponsored car blew its head gasket and cracked its block, forcing him to sell the car in Mexico as he lacked the funds to transport it home. Jean Trevoux, in his Packard, captured the first day, followed by the hastily prepared Mercury of Ruttman and Smith. The race claimed its first fatalities for the year as well, when José Menelcal, who had dramatically proclaimed he would win or die trying, lost control of his Packard and plunged 600 feet into a ravine, killing both himself and co-driver Miguel Gonzalez. 22 other cars also retired, demonstrating that, even with better preparation than the previous year, the Carrera remained merciless. The second day featured the most mountainous terrain, crossing elevations from 2,700 to 7,400 feet. Here, the Ferraris, now running more durable Goodrich rubber instead of their original Pirellis, began their comeback. Taruffi put in a record-breaking performance, leveraging his prior year's experience to move up to 3rd overall, while Giovanni Bracco, in his Lancia, improved dramatically from 54th to 18th. Troy Ruttman took the overall lead from Trevoux, and Alberto Ascari jumped from 45th to 13th, a commendable improvement as well. The day, however, was marred by another tragedy when Carlos Panini and his daughter Teresita, competing in an Alfa Romeo 6C, collided with the Jaguar Mark VII of Bobby Unser on a narrow section of road. Carlos, who was unlicensed and suffered from epileptic seizures, and was thus technically unqualified to compete, was killed instantly when their car hit a hillside. Though initial reports claimed Teresita had also died, she survived with only minor injuries. This second fatal incident in as many days soured public opinion, and media was quick to start calling for the race's cancellation. The longest day of the race covered 950 kilometers from Mexico City to Durango, beginning in the mountains before transitioning to faster prairie roads. Both Ferraris excelled, averaging an impressive 97 miles an hour on the first leg, which put them firmly in the lead. Taruffi maintained his advantage over Ascari, but both had clearly separated themselves from the rest of the field. Meanwhile, Lancia's hopes evaporated when Giovanni Bracco spun his Aurelia while attempting to pass Bill Sterling's Chrysler Saratoga near Querétaro. Though uninjured, he was unable to make the time cutoff and was thus disqualified. By day's end, attrition had claimed more than half the field, a stark indicator of the increasingly serious nature and pace of the competition, despite the superior preparation compared to the prior year. Following the rest day in Durango, which teams spent frantically repairing their cars rather than resting, the competition entered terrain more favorable to American machinery. With mountains largely behind them, the big V8s could finally exploit their power advantage on 2 predominantly straight stages to Chihuahua. Tony Bettenhausen demonstrated the American car's capabilities in his Kiefer-prepped Chrysler, averaging 110 miles an hour from Parral to Chihuahua to win the day's second leg. The Ferraris maintained their comfortable overall lead, with Taruffi content to finish 3rd in both segments. 24 drivers broke the previous year's speed record on the second leg, underscoring the rapid evolution from the inaugural event's somewhat experimental and rather amateurish nature to a serious professional competition. The final day had only a single leg, a 362-kilometer sprint to Ciudad Juarez, which drew more than 200,000 spectators despite growing public anger over the race fatalities. These crowds pressed dangerously close to the course, held back only by sirens, police, and warnings broadcast from a spotter aircraft. Bettenhausen again won, showcasing Detroit's straight-line speed and averaging 112.7 miles an hour to win the final leg, crossing the finish line at nearly 130. Taruffi and Ascari, however, staged a crowd-pleasing photo finish and crossed the line together despite having an 8-minute gap in the overall standings. The final classifications thus confirmed Ferrari's dominance. Taruffi was first, Ascari second, with Bill Sterling taking the final podium position in his Chrysler, narrowly edging out Ruttmann's Mercury by 4 minutes. This fourth place nevertheless represented a remarkable achievement for such an unassuming and last-minute entry, and it boded well for Lincoln's future competitive prospects. Jean Trevoux, Packard, Marshall Teague, Hudson, the Rogers in their Cadillac, Ray Crawford and Frank Valdez in a Lincoln, the Mexican team of Antonio José Solana and Alfonso Iniesta, Oldsmobile, and Robert Smead and John Renier in a Nash completed the top 10. Taruffi's winning time of 21 hours, 57 minutes, and 52 seconds, and Ascari's second place secured more than $40,000 in prize money for themselves and Maranello, but more important was the marketing opportunities. Ferrari, in its few years of existence, had so far sold a mere 3 cars in North America. That was about to change. Post-race complaints inevitably surfaced, with some competitors arguing that the purpose-built Ferrari racing cars violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the competition rules. Others suggested they had used superior fuel or employed team tactics for unfair advantage. The more sporting entrants, like Ruttmann, simply acknowledged that the better cars had won. Race officials, while declaring the event a success, promised to consider a handicap system for the next running to balance the performance discrepancies between European sports cars and American sedans. Perhaps the most enduring consequence of the 1951 Pan Am came not on the racecourse, but in a business arrangement. As appreciation for his contributions as Taruffi's co-driver, Enzo Ferrari granted Luigi Chinetti exclusive rights to import and distribute Ferrari automobiles in North America. This commercial decision would establish the foundation that would later give birth to the North American racing team, who were arguably the most significant privateer operation in 20th century motorsport. The Carrera Panamericana thus closed the book on its 1951 chapter with a clearer picture of what it was becoming: faster, more professional, more dangerous, and increasingly prestigious on the international racing calendar. By 1952, the Carrera Panamericana had shed its regional curiosity status and was starting to attract the European racing aristocracy. The French and Germans had awakened to Mexico's siren call, with Gordini, Porsche, and, most significantly, Mercedes-Benz joining Ferrari and Lancia in pursuit of Latin American glory. This additional influx of continental engineering prowess prompted the promised bifurcation of the competition into sports and stock classes. The stock class remained largely consistent with prior iterations. Vehicles were required to be capable of carrying 4 passengers and only have factory-available equipment, with ostensible production minimums of 5,000 units, though enforcement proved predictably elastic on that latter point. The sports class, conversely, was essentially unrestricted. Any 2-seat vehicle with 4 wheels, bumpers, and illumination manufactured between 1949 and 1952 qualified for entry. Supercharged power plants were permitted for the first time, with the sole mechanical constraint being that the engines finish what they started. Mechanical intervention between stages was permitted, but mid-race tinkering was restricted exclusively to driver and co-pilot. One notable modification to the rules from previous years was the termination of complementary fuel. This was an economic concession that required contestants to pay for their own petrol and lubricants, the former from the race-organized filling station, and the latter, I believe, from a race-organized commissary. While the participant roster remained dominated by private entrants with modest backing, prospects for victory were centered around the manufacturer-supported teams with their superior resources and preparation. Ferrari arrived with purpose-built 340 Mexico models, each housing a 4.1-liter V12 generating 275 horsepower and capable of 174 miles an hour. 3 of these cars were provided and piloted by Ascari, Villoresi, and Luigi Cinetti, with Giovanni Bracco's Mille Miglia Conquering 250S as a reserve car. Mercedes-Benz, however, arrived and prepared with a Teutonic thoroughness that would become racing legend. Team director Alfred Neubauer deployed his drivers to Mexico 3 weeks before the event with multiple practice vehicles. They accumulated tens of thousands of reconnaissance miles, with Klenk, the co-driver for Kling, meticulously documenting every sinuous kilometer of the route to be able to provide his partner with real-time commentary. The team's logistical apparatus also included 2 chartered DC-3 aircraft and a convoy of support vehicles, though Neubauer later lamented, with characteristic German pessimism, that he thought he should have brought twice as many vehicles and supplies. Lincoln approached the stock class with similar methodical diligence, taking pace notes and deploying 1953 models that featured heavy-duty dampers, specialized brake cooling ducts, and truck-derived camshafts generating nearly 300 horsepower from their V8s. These Bonneville-tested machines were capable of achieving velocities approaching 120 miles an hour in stock form, and all further modifications were defensively listed in the forthcoming sales literature, although it's unclear whether anybody actually bothered to spec one out in person. The inaugural stage commenced at 0700 with 27 sports and 64 stock entries. Mercedes, despite their exhaustive preparation, managed to succumb to the same adversary that had plagued Ferrari the prior year. Not Lancia, but instead the road. Their specialized Continental tires, despite being designed for hard running, were woefully unprepared for the abrasive, pumice-rich road to Oaxaca. The first mechanical casualty, on the other hand, was a Gordini, with Robert Manzon's rear axle surrendering mere miles from the starting line. The race's most well-remembered incident also took place on that day, and involved Kling and Klenk encountering a congregation of vultures during a high-speed right-hander. While most of the scavengers dispersed, one particularly aerodynamically challenged specimen was hit, shot through the windscreen, Klenk's unhelmeted head, he'd managed to forget it at a previous stop, and then exited through the rear window, rendering Klenk unconscious. Upon coming to, he insisted they continue to a scheduled tire change 43 miles distant before seeking medical attention. The subsequent morning, all 3 Mercedes vehicles sported protective steel bars across their windshields, a modification that thrilled the press, but brought what can only be called amused derision from the other competitors.
They've overdone it, as usual, like they did on their French holiday in 1939.
Okay, that's 2 Nazi jokes, we're done. Jean Perra, on the other hand, vindicated the French entries by claiming the day's victory with an average speed approaching 90 miles an hour, surpassing the previous year's record by nearly 10, and despite 4 interruptions, including 3 tire replacements and another avian contretemps. Among the Lincolns, Walt Falconer finished a mere 5 seconds ahead of Pat Kirkwood's Chrysler, while Robert Korf's third-place finish was compromised by having to retrieve his co-driver, Phil Gow, who inadvertently fell out of the car during aggressive cornering. The second day, however, proved catastrophic for French aspirations. Despite Berra's promising lead, he never materialized at the midday checkpoint. Villoresi, shortly behind and cresting an incline, observed extended tire marks descending the opposite side, where Berra had lost control and tumbled into a crevice. The Frenchman escaped with a concussion and some contusions, but his competitive chances were at a conclusion. The other drivers struggled most with the town of Acatlan, where the main street had been closed due to the loose surface in the lead-up to the race. Police officers posted to provide signals were reportedly encouraging drivers to speed up, and given that these were supposed to be helpful and trustworthy people, the drivers obliged, and invariably slid right into the curbs at the center of town. Jack McAfee and Phil Hill both damaged their Ferraris, and nary a wheel escaped without at least some scuffing. Cinetti, on the other hand, was almost caught out in the same location as Berra, but managed to recover. 10 other entrants were not so lucky, and Villoresi won the leg, but remained behind Bracco overall, who took over the lead of the race, while Fitch and Kling took their Mercs into Puebla with the second and third best times. Setting out again for the shortest but most technical leg, the Ferraris really put their maneuverability to good use, and Villoresi again made it across the line with the best time, breaking Taruffi's record by more than 8 minutes to average more than 100 miles an hour on roads that the average motorist typically found challenging at 30. Bracco was less than a minute behind and held his first place standing, but the three Germans were a model of consistency after their first day struggles, and Kling was closely followed by Fitch and Hermann Lang to close out the top 5 for the sports class. The twisting volcanic route also claimed the race's sole fatality when Santos Letona Diaz's XK120 collided with a wandering pedestrian. Lincoln's hegemony in the stock class, meanwhile, was solidified as Pat Kirkwood's Chrysler and Bill Sterling's Cadillac withdrew, leaving Faulkner, Mance, Stevenson, and Korf in a dominant 1-2-3-4 formation. The race's longest day commenced with fog approximately 50 miles beyond Mexico City, necessitating uncharacteristic caution. Mercedes had modified their coupes overnight to mimic the rear-quarter design of Fitch's open-topped car for improved tire cooling, as they anticipated the need for better heat control as the race route straightened out and speeds increased. Jack McAfee was suffering persistent tire failures at 130 miles an hour due to thermal buildup in his Ferrari's magnesium wheels, while Villoresi managed to claim another stage victory, further reducing Bracco's advantage. The Mercedes contingent maintained their metronomic performance for the first half of the day, finishing 4th, 5th, and 6th, with Neubauer finally authorizing unrestricted racing warfare with 1,001 miles remaining. There was a full Mille Miglia still to play for in pursuit of the race win. This shift in Mercedes' strategy also coincided with Ferrari's mechanical deterioration. Gearbox maladies that had simmered since the first day finally claimed Villoresi, despite Luigi Cinetti's car, the one that had been designated as the sacrificial parts repository. Anticipation of another Italian triumph in Durango, with most spectators wondering which of the Ferraris would come first, second, and third, was instead fulfilled by Kling and Clank, followed momentarily by Giovanni Bracco. The penultimate day commenced with 40 miles of what Phil Hill disparagingly characterized as goat trails, before straightening for the midday respite at Parral. Bracco's defensive strategy disintegrated as Kling traversed the leg at 106 miles an hour, reducing the Italian's advantage to a mere 2.5 minutes, while his Ferrari exhibited increasing mechanical maladies. After the 30-minute break, Bracco departed Parral with outright speed as his sole remaining hope for victory. But it was not to be. Bracco's transmission gave up after just 40 more miles, yet another potential Ferrari victory dissipated through transmission inadequacies. The Italian aspirations did persist, however, as Cinetti managed to make a daring pass on Lang, while Malioli's supercharged Lancia started a final attempt at a comeback. Kling still had his share of mechanical anomalies, most notably the spontaneous detachment of a gull-wing door at speed, and Fitch's alignment problems continued from the day prior, resulting in 3 tire failures before he managed to reach Chihuahua. Lincoln's dominance in stock remained unchallenged, as they claimed the top 5 positions in Leg 6 and widened their advantage over the competition. The finish attracted thousands to Juarez Airport to witness Germany and Italy's final confrontation. Fitch's departure was followed immediately by a turnaround to the mechanics for another alignment correction, which kicked off a frantic pursuit that culminated in his passing Kling and all other competitors. His 130-mile-an-hour plus average was promptly nullified by disqualification for receiving external assistance after starting and for reversing on the course. His protestation that he had an official exemption summarily dismissed. Kling and Clank then secured an indisputable victory with a 35-minute advantage over Hermann Lang and Erwin Gropp, with Cinetti and Lucas a further 41 minutes adrift. Malioli's Lancia claimed 4th, while Jack McAfee and Phil Hill completed the top 6. The Lincolns took positions 7 through 10, with Chuck Stevenson and Clay Smith leading a 1-2-3-4 formation finish. Johnny Mance and Bill Stropp were a mere 31 seconds behind, effectively a dead heat after 21 hours of competition. From 92 initial contestants, only 39 reached the terminus, with Enrique Pedrero's Dodge Coronet taking 9 additional hours in elapsed time to complete the 1,934-mile border-to-border expedition.